Welcome to my webinar. If you have ever been thinking about giving a TED Talk and you have absolutely no clue on what you would give a talk about or how you would even get started or how you even get selected, this workshop is for you. I gave my TED Talk back in 2013. I didn't plan to give a TED Talk at the time, so I'll talk you through how I got that opportunity. But more importantly, in this webinar today, I'm going to do three important things. Number one is to answer that question, what the heck would I even give a TED Talk on? Number two, I'm going to talk about the written piece of the application for a TED Talk and the video piece of submitting for a TED Talk, because there's nuances to how you craft that video pitch, and that's really important. And then the third thing that I'm going to offer you on this webinar is how you network to be able to be nominated, selected, considered. If you stay all the way to the end, I do have a gift for you, and I'm going to unveil what that gift is at the end. But I know that once you hear the video pitch part, you're going to want to actually stick around for that last piece. I think it's important for me to share who this workshop is for. You are thinking about sunsetting your career. You've already had a big career, but you're really thinking about legacy. And crafting a TED Talk with some real clarity around the message you want to share makes you poised and ready to do this very exercise. The second avatar of person I think that would be really keen to listen to this workshop today is somebody who maybe is just tied up a career in corporate. They've just started their own advisory or consultancy and they need clients. So that means that you're building a personal brand and you see the TED Talk as being a real keystone to building that personal brand. It's a real feather in your cap. The third avatar of person that probably wants to see this workshop maybe isn't necessarily thinking about a TED Talk, but they are thinking about how they could be seen better, how they could be heard better, how they could be understood better in meetings or at work or any kind of stage. So I want to make sure that you know that if you stay all the way through the end, I'm going to have a special gift for you, regardless of which of those buckets you fall into. The final thing I want to tell you is that I am enrolling for my mastermind, the class of 2025. I only enroll for that once a year and the applications are open now. So this workshop is not only an opportunity for you to get a taster of what I teach and how I teach it, but it's also an opportunity, if you stay all the way to the end, for you to apply to that mastermind. And it's a really special container. It's the crown jewel of my entire business. It's a 12-month program, but at the end, you are going to get up on a stage and you are going to give a TED style talk in front of a live audience. So I'm not going to be on screen because I've got so many juicy slides for you throughout this entire 30 minutes. So I really want those to take center stage, but I'll come back on at the end to be able to talk with you more. My name is Joya Das. Just to give you a little story about my background, for the last 27 years, I've been a news anchor here in New York City. And very specifically, I cover the financial markets. So I'm one of the gals that has been stationed on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. I look at several different terminals. I look at the information and I craft a story for 2 minutes every hour on the hour. And that's been my career for 27 years. But what's important about that is that I'm very good at taking really wonky technical information and make that very accessible and available to someone that is a consumer watching in the morning as they're getting their kids ready for school. Meta says that its future is all about AI. And if I were to think back to the rocket booster behind why I now have a mid-six-figure business today, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the very first thing that you could find when you search for Joya Das, I learned this from online dating as well, was my TED Talk. It really gave me the credibility because it was also the most raw and honest storytelling of my entire life at that point. It didn't matter that I'd been on TV for 10 years. It didn't matter that I, had this business. It was this little piece of audio and video that really catapulted me into a different light. And really, what is my business today? So I work with women leaders and some men on how to tell a better story about themselves. The gentleman that you can see on the right here, he's a chef. He'd been thinking about how he could tell better stories about his food. His clients were demanding it. To boot, he was also sitting on a supper club concept for 3 years, but he just couldn't tell those stories about his food. So we worked together, and at the end of it, he did host his first supper club for my friends and my clients. and he was able to tell great stories about his food. So I think that the TED Talk mechanism, the TED Talk framing is a great way for you to think about some really key things right off the bat. How is whatever you talk about in your industry, in your vertical, in your zone of genius is universal? In other words, if there was a plumber and an electrician sitting in the audience, they could still take away actionable items from your talk. And the second thing is, why do we need to hear your talk now? So, for example, with the chef, more people, especially since the pandemic, are really seeking out experiences. They're not necessarily looking to just buy material things. And so, what he's doing with his food is not just buying you another meal at a restaurant. He's actually creating an intimate experience around his food, which is delicious, by the way, for you, who is an adventure seeking, experience seeking person. So, what I've done is I actually polled some of you and asked you what's keeping you up at night when it comes to giving a TED Talk. And the number one thing was, how do I even get selected? Number two, oh man, I don't even know if my idea is big enough. Do I have an idea? Number three, am I expert enough to be on such a prestigious stage? Some people just poo pooed it right away. Other people were a little more, wanted to dive deeper. They were like, well, how do I turn my personal story into a single idea that's worth sharing? Like, how do I connect those dots? And then the final one, and I shared this one before, a friend of mine is a florist. She's like, I don't even know what I would give a TED Talk about. Well, nobody does. That's why there's some people like me who sit with you and work with you for at least a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks to really craft and redraft that talk and polish it into the point that you are a really, really shiny diamond before you take the stage. So today I'm just going to offer you like a really short sort of tutorial on that very question, which is, what would I even talk about? Well, here's a good place to start. What is your main message? In other words, if dinosaurs were destroying the earth and you could only get one line out, what would your main message be for anybody who's listening? So for me, I have a really successful series that I publish each week, which is called The Anatomy of a Good No. How do you say no in a professional setting and not burn any bridges? And it's really taken off in a critical way. So if I were to give a TED Talk today, the message would be that you can say no, but you need some frameworks in order to be nice about it and not burn any professional bridges. The second question I would ask you to consider when you're thinking about giving a TED Talk is, all right, we know a topic now that you could potentially talk about, but what is your unique position on that topic? So, for example, scripts were a lifeline for me while I was a TV anchor, and scripts are what I need today for leadership as a business owner. I'm in all kinds of situations and all kind of contexts with all different kinds of people. And I do need to say no, but I want to make sure that I'm coming across in a professional way and not burning any bridges. I do reserve the right to change my mind. At 51 years old, that's something that I've realized, but I always want to be kind in sharing that I can't no longer honor this commitment, even though I might have initially said yes. So it's frameworks that really help me to say no and do it nicely. That's my unique position on it, is that I need scripts as a TV anchor, scripts as a business owner today on how to say no. The third thing to consider when you're thinking about giving a TED Talk is, what is an assumption that you want to challenge or an assumption that you want to change? Now, I've always thought that if I changed my mind, I'm a bad person. And I had to unpack that a little bit because I grew up in a household where my folks were not necessarily the best at following through. And so as an adult, I became a real strict observer of my word. Like, I do as I say and I say as I do. In fact, because the pendulum just swung the opposite direction with me. I never wanted to be like my folks. But today I realize that changing my mind doesn't make me a bad person. It doesn't make me a flake. But I do need to make sure that I share that I changed my mind early. I do need to share that change of mind with kindness. And that blueprint for how I can share that I have changed my mind with an extreme level of kindness was what was missing. That was the missing dot in my life. You remember me saying this at the top of the workshop. What is universal about your message? Well, how could a plumber or an electrician or an artist still get value from my idea, even though from where I sit, I'm a journalist and I'm a coach and I'm a business owner? Well, I think that it's common knowledge that since the pandemic, people have been working themselves to the bone. Companies are doing far more with far less, and burnout is a real thing. So everyone could probably stand to hold a boundary right now if a commitment that they've made, whether it be professional or personal, is to his or her detriment. So what if you're negotiating payment terms on a job and the other party is negotiating you down? You want to say no to their terms, but you want to stay true to your values. What's a script? What's a framework that you can use to be able to come back and do it nicely? Why do we need to hear your message now? In other words, why now versus the 70s, the 80s? What's going on in the current headlines that requires your message and your TED Talk to be heard now? Well, I'm going back to my example. Women make up almost 50% of the US workforce, and women now hold about 30% of senior management roles worldwide. But think of us historically. Before the 70s, our likability was probably our biggest social currency. So society has expected us to be agreeable, to be nurturing, to be accommodating, but often it came at the expense of our own needs and our own boundaries. So now, as more women are expected to step into leadership roles by the year 2030, mastering the art of saying no is really critical to not only asserting your authority, but also preserving yourself as a leader. Your ability to lead is tied so tightly sometimes to your ability to take care of yourself. And if you're not saying no, you're burning out. All right, the next piece in this tutorial is what's the story that's going to support your message? In other words, there's a personal story from your entire life that you can use to support this message. In other words, when is a time that I had to say no and I knew that it was, if I said yes, it was going to be to my detriment. And so I'm electing to say no in the spirit of self-care, in the spirit of better business ownership, in the spirit of better leadership. So take 2 minutes right now and write down, if you have a piece of paper nearby, and maybe jot down 3 stories that you could use to support the main message that you've decided that you would give if you got on a stage and gave a TED Talk. I'm going to keep moving on as you're jotting those things down. But basically, now I've given you a formula. When you are so overwhelmed by the prospect of giving a TED Talk, here is a formula that you can follow in order to be able to start to craft and draft the ideas around your TED Talk. What is your takeaway message for the audience? What is your unique viewpoint on that particular message or topic? What story would you tell to support this? And then this is the gift for the audience. People often say, well, I can tell a personal story, but what does that have to do with the audience? When you share what you learned as a result of that story, that's when it becomes a gift. That's when it becomes a lesson for your audience, and it becomes actionable for them to be able to walk away and do something with that. So that's been a lot. I know that I've thrown a lot at you, but I hope that it's cut through a little bit of the overwhelm when you're thinking about a clear and concise idea for your written application. The next piece I'm about to dive into is, how do I apply? Now, know that in your TEDx application, there's a written component, much of which we've actually covered on how you craft that with those first few slides that I presented. But the second piece is the video pitch. Now, this is something that comes really second nature to me because I've spent a career in television, but I understand and totally acknowledge that this might not be something that comes natural to you. But even if it's in the written form, which I highly encourage that you do first, because that's going to lead to your clear thinking, and it's also going to lead to your clear speaking when you do the video pitch. Because in the video pitch, you're going to have to be very clear, and you're going to have to be very concise about what your talk is going to be about. In other words, summate your idea. The second thing in your video pitch is that you need to talk about why your idea matters. In other words, how can it benefit the audience? Why do we need to hear it? What's universal about it? Why do people need to hear it now? And then the other piece of the video pitch is your qualifications. Nobody says that you have to be a public speaker. In fact, TED prefers that you not be a public speaker. But you do need to demonstrate why you are the right person to deliver this message. What are your personal experiences? What are your insights? What is your expertise that qualifies you to be able to share this message today? So going back to my example, I've been a news anchor for 27 years. Now I'm a business owner. In both instances, I've had to say no in order to be able to take extremely good care of myself. I used to get up at 2:30 in the morning, be into work by 3:30, be on the air by 5. I was also in front of the camera. So it's not like I got to be, show up to work and kind of hide under a hoodie. I had to show up and be TV presentable. So that meant that I really had to take such good care of myself. And I don't feel like that necessarily has gone away today as a business owner. I will easily work from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. if I have to, but I know that I absolutely have to put my self-care first because entrepreneurship is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And more people are becoming entrepreneurs today. And they have this vision that they're going to get rich quick. They don't realize that this is not something that's going to necessarily be realized overnight. Those billions or millions that you see startup founders making probably was many years in the making. So how are you going to take good care of yourself in the process? So the sample video, you want to include a brief 2 to 3 minute video of yourself summating all of these points. But it's always a great idea to maybe even share previous stages that you've been on. So this judge that's, deciding on your prowess and your ability to take the stage, if you have the mettle to be able to do it. All right, here's some of the things that I see are common mistakes anytime anybody is doing a video. Don't forget good lighting. Your best friend is going to be natural light. In fact, I'm facing my window now. Face the window when you record any type of video. And don't forget good sound. People are always going to be very forgiving of bad video, but they are not going to be forgiving of bad sound. I actually have a Shure 7 mic that I use. It's the one that Joe Rogan uses because if people can't hear you, they're just going to shut the video off. Don't ramble. Make sure you have your points in a bullet pointed form, paste it at eye level, and all you need are trigger words. You don't want an essay on that little piece of paper. You want trigger words. So if you lose your train of thought, you can just glance over and you can keep going with your 2 to 3 minute spiel. And then this is something I learned from Debbie Millman, who is the host of the Design Matters podcast. She now teaches at the New School. She encourages you to do 10 drafts. 10 drafts before you submit the one that is going to be the official one. So don't be afraid to do 10 records before you arrive at the one that you're actually going to submit for your TEDx application. Some video do's. If your idea has already made an impact, in other words, maybe you've got a great initiative in your community for a cleanup effort and it's already had a ripple effect on the community, share that in your application. Let people know that you have a unique way of solving problems in this world and that you already are reaping the benefits of it. Your community is already reaping the benefits of it. Highlight specific results, anecdotes, and achievements. Why do I say this? Every time I work with a client, they love to talk in generalities. Well, I am a risk management so-and-so, and I manage risk and create algorithms. That's fine, but I want you to tell me about that one client in South America where you had to manage the risks of entering that country, and there was one thing, one nuance of operating in another country that you vastly overlooked and you're never going to overlook again. Specificity always wins out. Some other application do's. A lot of people feel stumped on how they could even begin to be considered for a TED Talk. Now, I actually had hosted a dinner and the person that was organizing the TEDx at Barnard was at that dinner. And she heard me talking, she heard me moderating. At the end of the night, she came up and she asked me because she had one last spot to fill and I was able to fill that because of what I demonstrated at the table. However, you can always go on a TEDx website. Chances are they have a Facebook page and you can find out who the organizers are. You can follow their social media accounts. You can stay updated for when the applications are going to open or when the event is going to be held.
Oftentimes, organizers will actually post specific tips or even scouting requests for speakers, which is how I got cast for my TEDx talk. Begin engaging with their content because that helps you get on their radar. Anywhere from 7 to 21 touch points is probably what most people need today to see and know that you exist. But that's a great way for you to start getting noticed. All right, questions and answers. I know a lot of you have been writing in with a lot of questions, so I put up a couple of them here. How long is a typical TEDx talk? Well, I cap my clients usually at 12 minutes because this is their very first time they're doing this thing. I want them to share one story, one message very powerfully and get that across. For somebody who's a more seasoned speaker, a TEDx talk can be 18 minutes. I like to think about Steve Jobs when he gave his commencement speech at Stanford in 2005. He's someone who's a seasoned speaker, so he was able to share 3 stories, 3 lessons, and then tie it up in a bow. So depending on your ability to sort of organize the material, because that's where TEDx talks really get lost, is how powerfully you organize that material would decide how long your TED talk is. But I particularly like 12 minutes as a good sweet spot for someone who's doing this for the first time. This person asks, how do I vary my voice, my volume, my pace? Because I really want to make sure I engage my audience. My rule of thumb is that you speak to the audience as you would if you were speaking to your kid. Think about reading them a bedtime story. If you were going to read the New York Times to them and you were going to read it in this very monotonous voice and you were going to tell them the facts and the data and the things, that would just never engage a little kid. And to be honest, I don't think a live audience is any different. Think about how animated and how you would vary up your pitch, your volume, the speed at which you talk when you're talking to a little kid. I think that those are all great rules to use when you're thinking about the delivery of your speech. This also goes back to that first question that I was answering, which is 12 minutes. 12 minutes is an eternity when you have to speak that animatedly. So think about brevity, but think about power in that brevity. Okay, the questions are really coming in now. How should I outline my talk? Well, I offered a little bit of a framework right at the beginning, but I'm going to recap that for the purpose of this question. What is your main takeaway message? What is the last thing, if the world was getting destroyed and you could get one message out for your audience, what would that main message be? Now, you can think about what is universal about that message and why do we need to hear that now? The next piece of the framework is to really think about a story, one micro moment in time that would support that message. Think really hard back into your career or your personal life even of a time that supports, in my case, when I said no and I did it nicely. The final piece of that framework is 3 lessons, 3 learnings that you had as a result of that story. And this is a little bit of the sort of, cherry on top. But once you've shared those lessons, I think it's a great idea to share how you're applying those lessons today. Because you can say, here's the lesson, but I think that when you share how you're applying it in the modern day example, provides people an idea in their mind how they could go away and use it too. Next question. How do I choose a topic? Well, I think that a great thing to do is go and ask 6 friends or 6 clients or 6 people in your professional universe, what is it that you would want me to talk about? You already have a brand out there. You just haven't done the legwork of asking people what they see. Your brand is your echo of what people remember about you. And so they're going to make sure you don't ask people that are, people pleasers are going to tell you what you want to hear. Make sure you're asking people that are going to be really honest and tell you, you know what, I think that you are really good at talking about X. So that's a good place to start. Another way to think about the topic is, what is it that your friends and family typically come to you for advice on? For me, it's organization, getting out of my comfort zone, executive presence, how to build a brand on LinkedIn. I know that because I'm in touch with my audience every single day. Next question. How can I make my talk memorable? Hands down, you are never, ever going to be forgettable if you share a deeply personal story, highly descriptive with a lot of emotion. Why is that important? So if you think about the way that we have shared stories and shared information through history, we've done it by sitting around a campfire and sharing stories. So Just to invoke a little bit of science, where we register high stakes, fight or flight, I'm going to be either hunting a lion or getting eaten by a lion. All of that registers in your limbic brain, which is the oldest brain in the human brain structure. So that's designed to keep you safe. So if you can provide a little bit of high stakes around what's at stake for the audience in your personal story, that's going to speak to that part of the brain. Now, think about the last time you cried when you watched a really sad movie or cried when you saw some really bad news on TV, on the TV news. That's because it's triggering your emotional brain. So, when you trigger an emotional brain, what are you doing? You're talking about what you smelled, you're talking about what you heard, you're talking about what you tasted, you're talking about what you did in that moment. If you can get so highly descriptive about a micro moment in time, people are going to start to have their own mirror neurons, that's another part of your brain, start to fire, and their imagination starts to fill in the blanks. They start to go on the journey with you. So think about a deeply emotionally charged personal story to illustrate the point or the message that you want to take, and you're always going to be memorable. How do I deal with nerves and the fear of public speaking? Great question. Well, I think that this is as much a mental game as it is an intellectual pursuit. So I'm a big advocate for meditation, journaling, and yoga. I would probably wager that I go to yoga 2 times a week, not necessarily for my physical fitness, but for my mental fitness. I know the weeks that I would face the camera and I didn't go to yoga, I could immediately feel it. It was like my brain was formatted differently. So I would really think deeply about Bikram yoga or something that's not only going to give you the stamina, but also is going to give you the mental calm that you need when your nerves start to get the best of you. The other piece about dealing with nerves is that you got to practice. If you practice your talk over and over and over and over and over again, so much so that you have a really good handle on the information, nothing's going to be able to beat you. And then the final tip I'll offer in answer to this question is when you offer a personal story, it's so much easier to tell because it was your lived experience. Why would you make it any harder on yourself? So really think about that deeply personal story that you can share because it's just going to help you with your delivery and with your nerves. This next question, well, how can I get selected to speak at a TEDx event? Like, what are the key things that TED organizers are looking for? Well, when I think back to when I was cast for my TED Talk, the TED organizer knew that there was a specific theme. That year, it was rethinking failure. And she overheard me talking about failures. And then came up and asked me, she's like, have you experienced failure? And I very quickly rattled off a series of moments that I experienced failure. I left home at 18 because I'm born to immigrant parents who necessarily weren't behind my dream of becoming a news anchor. I knew nobody in television, so I really had to network my way into a space where I had the contacts and the connects to be able to forge a career in it. So she knew that I had the ability to command a stage. She knew that I already had experienced failure pretty intimately. And then she was just looking for that special something. I think that I was able to express myself because I'd done business news for so many years in a very concise and clear manner. I wasn't afraid of being able to be in front of an audience, but also had some clarity around what my business stood for at that time, which was empowering South Asian women. And she saw that. So I think that in short, TEDx organizers are really looking for someone who probably has a little bit of chutzpah, can handle the stage, but also has some clarity and conciseness around the idea that they want to share. Again, I default back to what's universal about your message? Why do we need to hear it now? How personal should my story be? I get this all the time because I think that sharing a really deeply personal story takes a lot of courage, and not necessarily everybody has that courage. I'm probably at a level 10. I ask my clients to meet me at like a level 5. Now, if you share a personal story, you can be choosy about what parts of that you share. But the point is to really ground that emotional story in a bigger idea. In other words, you're sharing this thing in service of a bigger idea. Let me give you an example. I had a woman who is an artist who took the stage last year. She had gone through a very tough time in that she had lost her daughter after day 1 of birth. And the thing that she wanted to impart upon the audience is she could have turned to a myriad of things, drugs, alcohol, any kind of vice. But she was an artist, so she turned to her paintbrushes and her canvas. And the message she wanted to bring to the audience was, when she shows up to the canvas shows up for her. You can do this with anything. You can do this with journaling. When you show up to the page shows up for you. The point being that she wanted to share that there's a very constructive way that you can explore and heal. And so she shared that without compromising, anybody in her family, without compromising any of her own feelings, but she preserved the lesson. The strategy is to preserve the lesson, how she arrived at this healing moment, and share that as a gift for the audience. And then you work with a professional like me, because we can peel back the layers. We can peel back exactly how much of that story and the lesson is preserved without making you feel like you've been laid bare on stage. The final thing I'll also say is that you got to back up your personal story with data. So remember how I said earlier that 30% of today's senior leadership roles, VP roles, director roles, are occupied by women. And by the year 2030, that number is due to tick up to about 33.2%, especially in certain parts of the world. That means that the onus is on us as women now more than ever to make sure that we're saying no and doing it nicely in a professional setting to preserve our authority and in the spirit of self-care. And the final question that's here, what are the most important qualities of a successful TEDx talk? Is it storytelling? Is it data? Or is it a combination of both? It's both. So much of our learning from you is going to be in your story. You are the conduit. You are the story provider by which we are going to learn. But then you need to back that thing up with data. And you're going to be able to back that up with 3 lessons that you're going to share with me by virtue of you having gone through that experience or that micro moment. All right, one more question. I saw a TEDx event theme like reinventing the future. How do I align my talk to a theme? All right, I'll go back to the example of what I'm providing here today, which is that it's important to say no and have a framework for how you say it so you can maintain your professional relationships. As I said, more and more women are going to become the future of work. If 30% now have senior leadership roles, that number is due to tick up to about 33.2% in parts of Africa and Oceania. And in the US, the future is a little bit delayed, and women assuming leadership roles, we could be anywhere between 2030 and 2037. So that means that more and more women are going to have to become familiar with and adept at saying no and doing it nicely as they realize more senior leadership roles and hold a boundary in the interest of self-care. So notice that I took my theme, the thing I wanted to talk about, and neatly sort of tied it to reinventing the future. I probably could talk a little bit about, in my TED Talk, how we would advance more women in the workplace. And scripts and how to say no is just one piece or one keystone to doing that.
Whew. Okay, that was a jam-packed 30 minutes full of information and all kinds of Q&A.